Hey everyone, I'm here with your Monday video devotion for you to share with your family. Today, I'd like to focus on a story that is featured this week in the lectionary from Genesis chapter 22. This story is perhaps one of the most upsetting, I think, in the whole Bible. It's the story where God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. Remember that Isaac was the miracle child. He was born when Abraham and Sarah were about 100 years old. Isaac was supposed to be the one that began to fulfill God's promise to Abraham. The promise that said Abraham would be the father of many nations. The promise that said Abraham's descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. This story is upsetting for several reasons. Yes, it's upsetting because God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. It's also upsetting because Abraham doesn't appear to tell Sarah, Isaac's mother, what he's about to do. It's upsetting that Abraham makes Isaac carry the wood that will be his own sacrificial altar. It's upsetting because God appears to be just testing Abraham's obedience, and who likes to be tested? Now, if you're familiar with this story, then you know that it has a good outcome. God stops Abraham in the end and provides a ram that would take Isaac's place. But what do we make of this story, or other stories in the Bible that make us uncomfortable, stories that might offend the values that we hold today in 2020? I want to offer one way that might help us understand, and that's by fitting this story into the broader story of God from Genesis to Revelation, the whole Bible. First, it's important to know that human sacrifice, even child sacrifices, were a part of many ancient religions. And Abraham didn't have any kind of law to follow. The Ten Commandments, any other codes of conduct had not yet been written down. Abraham was simply listening to God. And so, even though God's command to sacrifice his son was a torturous one, Abraham believed that he had to be obedient. Just as a side note, I also want to point out that Isaac was no small child at the time. If Isaac was strong enough to carry the wood that would have served as his own burning table, we might assume that he was a teenager or even a young man at the time, which tells us how faithful Isaac must have been to God's commands too. Abraham was over 100 years old. What 100-year-old man could have bound and placed a young man onto a sacrificial altar against his will? Couldn't be done. Isaac had the same faith as his father. But back to the point of human sacrifices, when God swoops in and gives Abraham an animal sacrifice instead, this story sets the stage for a new type of religion, one in which God doesn't desire human sacrifices, but one in which animal sacrifices are desired instead. Later, when God instructs the Israelites through Moses on the proper ways to worship, this new system of sacrifices becomes the center point of it. For Christians, we also see how this story is similar to the story of Jesus, how Jesus was like a sacrificial lamb that took the place of all people. And just as Isaac was Abraham's only son, Jesus was God's only son. You might be thinking, wait a minute, I thought God didn't want human sacrifices. Well, while yes, Jesus was a human, Jesus was also God. And so this is more like a self-sacrifice on God's part. And so it's really neat to see how and when the whole Bible reads like a single story, even though it consists of dozens of different texts written over many centuries. The story of Abraham and Isaac invites us to think about how our choices have a cost to them. And that's the purpose of a sacrifice after all, to pay for our choices or our sins. I invite you to read the story of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis chapter 22 as a family, and then talk about what sacrifice means to you. What are you willing to sacrifice for God, knowing that God sacrificed his son for you? Until next time, I wish God's blessings on you and your family, and we hope to see you very soon.